IVM.
Hi, everybody. Just wanted to ask everyone for a quick favor. We're running a brand survey right now and would really appreciate it if you could let us know what you think about the advertising on IVM. Go to ivmpodcast.com/survey and do let us know. As part of this, we'll be selecting 10 random participants and sending them some IVM swag, so do fill out those surveys.
Hello and welcome to the Wire Talks. I'm Siddharth Bhatia. The death of Father Stan Swamy, an 80-year-old who was in prison for 9 months facing charges of terrorism, has once again focused sharp attention on the issue of human rights. A crusader for the rights of tribals, Father Swamy had been arrested under the dreaded Unlawful Atrocities Prevention Act, which allows the police to hold the accused for an almost unlimited period. Bail is virtually impossible to get. 15 others, including Professor Anand Teltumbde and trade unionist and activist Sudha Bhardwaj, have been in jail for 3 years or so under this very law. Human rights have always been a controversial subject in India. Governments have been openly hostile and the public suspicious of what they mean. This has allowed the police, under all kinds of political dispensation, to freely disregard civil liberties laws and arrest suspects at random, many of them who are later found innocent. This has allowed the police, under all kinds of political dispensations, to freely disregard civil liberties laws and arrest suspects at random, many of whom are found totally innocent many years later. What exactly do we mean when we say human rights? To explain this very concept and to clarify doubts and misconceptions, we have today with us Advocate Shaadan Farasat, who has defended many individuals targeted by the state. A graduate of the National Law University and Harvard, he practices in the Supreme Court. His areas of practice include constitutional law, civil and criminal law, and also commercial law. Welcome, Shaadan Farasat, to the Wire Talks.
Thank you. It's a pleasure being here.
So there are a lot of misconceptions about what human rights are, what they mean. Please tell us in layperson's term what they are.
Yeah, human rights are just what they say they are. That is, the rights of human beings. It's something as fundamentally simple as that. And it's not of a particular human being or not. It applies to any human being, and every human being have some inalienable rights. To give just a recent example, we had such a massive oxygen crisis in India during the second COVID wave. And that impacted literally almost every family, every section of the society, and every citizen. And I think that's the best recent example I can give of how human rights of people were violated. That is, they did not have access to proper medical care and oxygen when it was required. So it's not something which applies only to a section or a political section of people, but to everybody across the board. I think what has happened historically, though, is that governments tend to violate human rights of certain sections of society more, usually the minorities, etc. And therefore, it has got framed, the issue of human rights has got framed in a certain context where certain sections of the society, the ones who are relatively well-heeled, who are sort of the power center in a given socio-political setup, feel that it's not of concern to them because their human rights are really not going to be violated. The state is not going to target them or is not going to be oblivious to their needs. But I think, again, to use the same example as the recent oxygen crisis and the medical care crisis and COVID generally has shown that really none of us are beyond the issue of violation of human rights, irrespective of how much we earn, how much money we make, how well-heeled we are, how many contacts we have. Human rights is the issue that concerns each of us. So I think it's something as simple as that.
And yet, governments are openly hostile. The public is suspicious largely because of the way they have been presented or understood. Why is that? Why in a country where these things happen quite blatantly and are rampant? I mean, even if most people didn't understand that the COVID crisis and the oxygen crisis was something to do with their human rights, why do people say, human rights are not that important in a country like ours?
Yeah, I think the reason for that is that state, what it does is, in order to justify its existence, political existence, it seeks to target certain groups and seeks to show to other groups within the society that, listen, actually that targeting of those groups is necessary for your safety. Usually it happens in the context of a certain power structure which is already existing. That is, you have a dominant group in this, or a religious or a racial majority, and you have a non-dominant group or a religious or a racial minority. In the context of India, you will have Dalits, Muslims are the two sort of minorities on caste and religious lines. In the context of US, it's African Americans or Latin Americans, so Hispanic Americans. So what happens is, the framing that is done by state is that it is actually essential for protecting the interest of certain groups to target certain other groups. And I think that framing then seeks to justify to a large section of the population that this is actually really for your good. And therefore, the context of human rights in the context of those humans who are being targeted is actually something which is not going to help you. In fact, it's going to damage you. And I think that at some level, is psychologically imbibed by groups because of the continuous sort of framing and the mass media which today exists. And therefore, people are not able to actually see that in a healthy society, it's absolutely necessary to have all groups of people, irrespective of what their identities are, enjoy certain fundamental human rights in terms of civil liberties, also in terms of certain basic access to, just day-to-day needs of life. And I think that framing helps all states. But in recent times, we have seen that got accelerated with populist leaders, normally from the right wing, but not almost exclusively, but normally from the right wing. Sort of enhance those insecurities and frame human rights as something which is detriment to the dominant group.
India has some of the most stringent laws which are violative of, in a sense, of the concept of human rights. Especially for a democratic country, India has some really, really strong laws. UAPA was first introduced in a different form in the 1960s. There have been since then MISA, TADA, NSA, and UAPA was strengthened by the Manmohan Singh government. And don't these go against, I know that governments can say these are our internal matter, but don't these laws go against the many compacts and treaties India has signed, international?
Yeah, so I think the question of anti-terror laws, or special laws as they are called, which are effectively a divergence from the normal criminal law of the Indian Penal Code and the Criminal Procedure Code which exist, is an issue of serious it has been an issue of serious concern and debate in our Indian context. I mean, just to give some background, I mean, of course, UAPA existed since 1967, but it did not have a lot of other provisions which now are considered problematic. But TADA was really, in that sense, the big anti-terror law from the 80s. And that came in a certain context of India facing effectively insurgency in both Punjab and Kashmir. And I think that was the immediate anxiety which led to the proclamation of TADA. That was upheld to be constitutional by the Supreme Court in the 90s. And then you had, of course, POTA, which came because TADA ran out in terms of its timeline. And then you had POTA, which was introduced in 2001-2, first as an ordinance and then as an act. And that was subsequently repealed when the government changed. The UAPA amendments, which you are mentioning, came in the context of the Bombay attack and post that. And you didn't have a terror law on the book of the sort which existed earlier. So I think the Congress government at the time was sort of trying to balance, something with a new terror incident in Bombay. In that context, the law came. I think the root question with special laws is that, can we not investigate and treat alleged cases of terror with the existing mechanism under IPC and CRPC? That is, if you have effective investigation, Because what does UAPA do? The problematic provision which is today there is in respect of bail. It in effect says that if you find a prima facie case by the prosecution and then you cannot release the person on bail. That's the mandate on the court. Still the obligation is on the prosecution to show prima facie case, but in most cases it's not too difficult to show a prima facie case because you really don't have the other side story in terms of the defense. So even if the documents are not very difficult, although if a court were to closely examine, as the High Court in Delhi recently did in the case of Devangana, Kalita and Asif, it is clearly possible to then dislodge that burden. So the point I'm making is that these provisions are introduced because there is an assumption that terrorists who are not like regular criminals will get away if they are just subjected to the normal criminal procedure and normal IPC. But I think if we really have good investigation and we really have good agencies, then I think that situation should not arise. And I think more than anything else, the fact that we have these special provisions which seek to limit liberty is actually based on assumption that our agencies are not able to function in a fully professional, efficient way when it comes to terror cases. So I think if we improve that aspect, then even the courts will be willing more to sort of declare these laws as unconstitutional. Because I think the concern which the courts have while declaring them constitutional is that do we really have an effective mechanism in case of terror incidents?
That allows the police to often cast aside any kind of concern about the idea of civil liberties and just arrest at random and then say, throw them into jail and then say, oh, we are investigating and it takes time. But in Stan Swami's case, the NIA didn't even bring charges. It's a little bit of a catch-22, isn't it? I mean, the judiciary buys the idea, the media sells the idea, the public is convinced, and this 80-year-old man and so many others who are still in jail continue languishing for years because the investigating agencies simply don't move ahead.
Yeah, I think the Stan Swami case and the Bhima Koregaon cases, I think there are two different classes of cases, right? So you have genuine solid terror cases where something like 43D5 of UAPA will apply. I mean, you can look at the Mumbai attack, for instance. I don't think any of us are going to dispute the fact that in cases such as those are genuine cases for application of a UAPA law. However, when you apply, or really speaking, in these cases, you weaponize the anti-terror law to target people who are just opposed to the government of the day and just ideological opponents, then of course that's using anti-terror law for a completely oblique purpose. And I think courts should in those cases be very, very vigilant. And just because the provisions of UAPA have been invoked, should not just look away. And I think there are ways and means courts which want to intervene can do it. There are always creative ways for a judge who understands the Constitution, understands the obligations under the Constitution in terms of right to personal liberty, can always frame an order so that the justice is done. So I think the Stan Swami case is one where I think justices fail to do it. And my sense also is that in Bhima Koregaon case, despite what we have seen, despite the fact there is so much material now that even the evidence which the police claims was apparently planted using software which is mostly been sold to governments. It's not even available with private entities. That by itself shows, there are serious problems with the case. And there was, even at the beginning, there was a dissenting view in the Supreme Court, which said that it does not seem like a genuine case by one of the judges. So I think this is one case, Bhima Koregaon generally and Stan Swami specifically, where the courts have really not been able to discharge their constitutional obligation in the manner which is expected, particularly by use of terror law for an oblique purpose.
Therefore, one could argue, and as you have said it too just now, but one can argue that the intention is less to prove the charges or even attempt to prove the charges than just keep them in jail, maybe as a chilling factor, maybe as to show that something is being done. And there are reports that they are being treated quite cruelly, heartlessly. There were other reports which said that Stan Swamy was not given a sipper. So one gets the sense, therefore, that it's the political optics of it all.
Yeah, no, that's correct. I mean, I guess the idea really is not so much to prove the case, but to make the process the punishment and use the stricter provisions for bail as a mechanism really to tell a court that you can't even consider bail, and then not bother really about proving charges, because there is not much to prove, because most of these cases at trial, which involves a more detailed analysis of what the evidence is and the counter materials placed by the defense, are likely to collapse. So the idea is to make the process a punishment, make it a prolonged one, and really not allow the courts to intervene in any meaningful way. So I think that is why it's all the more important that courts have to see through this and really develop ways which will ensure that justice, as envisaged under a constitutional setup, is delivered.
Why do you think courts don't? I mean, the courts can take a completely independent view, and yet, except for this recent case in the Delhi High Court, why are courts so reluctant? Because, again, the courts don't even give minor relief for them to get out and forget long-term bail, but even minor relief. Why are they so reluctant?
I think some of it is, of course, like any system in judiciary as well, we have judges who are temperamentally more conservative, not conservative in a political sense, but conservative in a judicial sense in terms of how much they are willing to probe the state. And you have judges who are more proactive. Some of it is, of course, determined in terms of the temperament of the judicial temperament, as it were, of the judges you get in a specific matter. One reason is probably, I think they have not fully appreciated, maybe also because of their own, some socio-economic sort of agency, the kind of targeting and the kind of dehumanization that is happening through these kind of false cases. I think it's important that they are able to, I hope that they are able to empathize more strongly with the victims of such state targeting. And I think once that happens, we should hopefully see more proactive approaches, irrespective of what the specific judicial temperament of the judge concerned is.
I remember during the emergency too, the way habeas corpus was disregarded and cast aside, but yet there were lawyers and judges who were ready to take up the issue. They fought, and some fought successfully. It's not as though the entire Supreme Court had completely leaned over to the one side, and that we have seen gradually has got eroded.
Yeah. No, I was not, emergency is not something, I am from the post-emergency period, so I don't have first-hand experience, but insofar as Supreme Court is concerned, I think the collapse in Supreme Court was almost substantial. It was complete during emergency. So I do think that Supreme Court certainly did collapse during the emergency. I don't think there's any doubt on that. Yes, high courts and other courts did try and do their bit, but not so much the Supreme Court. And I think that's one that's pretty well documented even by judges who were at that relevant time. They have acknowledged that, yes, they could not do what was expected of them. I mean, except for, we are aware of some famous dissents like Justice Khanna, but otherwise, institutionally, there was a collapse. Today's time, I think we have also a situation where different sections of the judiciary are responding differently. I think we have recently seen some more proactive moves by High Court, be it on COVID oxygen crisis or be it on civil liberty issues. Of course, it's not anything which is uniform in the sense that you can be sure that if you are being wrongly targeted, you will get relief by court. But certainly that is an encouraging sign. And in Supreme Court as well, I think there are some encouraging signs in terms of, despite all that we have seen in the last 3 or 4 years, I think there's some encouraging signs. How that will play out in the medium to long term, we'll have to wait and watch. I just feel that judiciary also gets, to some extent, its strength from civil society, media. And I think one major reason why I think the complete collapse of media as an independent accountability mechanism against the government I think that has also weakened other institutions. So, I mean, every institution looks at the next institution at some level to see, to get strength. And the fact that you have had such a severe collapse of media, and not just collapse, they have become effectively propagandists for the government, irrespective of how brutal the government is. I think that has also reduced the ability to some extent of the judiciary to act more independently.
So they become, in that sense, part of the larger narrative that's being played out in the country, is it?
Yeah, I guess, I mean, judges are also human beings. So it would be completely unreasonable to, my senses, expect them to be divorced from what is happening outside. So if there is a system, an ecosystem in which accountability is being maintained, I think it's that much easier for the judges to be part of that process. Whereas if the system, the ecosystem is not one of where accountability is maintained, it's equally easy for them to be part of that ecosystem. So I guess what is the larger ecosystem also impacts how judges react. I'm not saying that necessarily justifies if a judiciary is not carrying out what it's supposed to constitutionally, but I'm offering that as an explanation of what may actually be happening and why judiciary is at least part of the reason why judiciary is not responding in cases as we sometimes expect them to.
Over the years, I think one saw a lot in the late 70s when the emergency was lifted. And since then, civil liberties organizations have come up and they did very good work the early days to spread the word about many things. And then since then, many, many successful agencies have NGOs, advocacy organizations. And since then, many other agencies such as NGOs and advocacy organizations have worked to talk about rights of not just individuals, but also sections of society. But do you think they've not been able to successfully convey the idea of human rights being important? Often their messaging is full of jargon. It's often quite difficult to penetrate by the lay citizen. There is always suspicion that they are funded by foreign organizations. I'm kind of overgeneralizing here, but I think this is a fairly valid assumption that one key section, which was to take the message to a wider population, has not really been able to fulfill its role properly.
No, you're certainly right. I think one of it is that treating human rights as some kind of a purely technical or legal issue is counterproductive. So I think when human rights groups or activists are trying to reach out to the public, I think it's important that they have to speak the language of the masses as well and keep it simple. So, for instance, even this program we are doing today in English, maybe we should consider doing one in Hindi as well, at some time. So because the access to ideas has to be to the larger masses as well. It's not just something which should be restricted to experts or professionals, as it were. So I think that is quite important. But I think the failure also in part lies to some extent. Again, I think we cannot blame the human rights activists or those who work in the area of human rights totally, because the propagandist media is very, very difficult to counter. I mean, if you open any TV channel in the evening these days, see what you see there and what you hear there. And if that's the narrative which a regular person is hearing every night when he comes back from work, it's obviously going to have an impact on him. So I think it's not just a failure of activists, but it's partly that. But what I would suggest as a mechanism, and that's generally just the way I as well function, is we should not try and silo human rights as a separate thing. I think it's also important that we sort of make human rights as part of everything, as something which is very normal, as part of day-to-day life. And that kind of a framing, that kind of, that's also part of the kind of work I do. I don't, consider myself a human rights lawyer. I consider myself a lawyer for everything. And I do work which also includes civil liberties or what would be described human rights. But I think that's important that therefore it permeates every profession, every area. It is not siloed as to something which is done only by human rights activists or human rights professionals. I think that is probably counterproductive.
Just picking up one point from your answer, I think you're absolutely right that such programs need to be done in Hindi and many other Indian languages. and that the English speaking section is very, very small, however, quite influential. I may also just add one other dimension to your point, is that even the so-called English-speaking elite, the educated upper middle class, so-called English-speaking elite, is not necessarily fully convinced about it. So therefore, has to be a massive all-round effort.
No, I agree with you. I think that is absolutely correct. It's not as if the upper middle class who watch English news channels or who are fluent in English or whose primary source of news or information is English media are sympathetic or understand the issues of human rights. And that's where the second point comes in, that I think we have to frame it not as an issue just of what a bunch of activists do, but really it's important that it impacts every notion, of our every aspect of our life. And that's where I think something as crucial as the oxygen crisis in India shows, that really nobody is beyond violation of human rights, and people who have all the contacts in the world could not get hospital beds for their loved ones and could not get oxygen in time. So I think it shows that really these are not issues which do not impact a certain section of the society. Really, in a given situation, it can impact anybody. And I hope people have some learnings from that experience.
You mentioned the media twice, I think at least. And I have to agree with you as a practitioner, as a professional in the media for a long, long time. I have seen waves come and go, in the sense that there was a time in which any violation of human rights used to get big front page play. There were reporters who specialized in the issue, went out, got back fantastic stories. Today, I have been thinking that something like Stan Swamy or the Bhima Koregaon case, which obviously is now looking shakier than ever, and so many other journalists being arrested, there would have been a continuous hue and cry about it, not one-offs. And that would have forced the police and the judges to take some kind of action. Here, things are happening with impunity.
Yeah, absolutely. And on what do we see on evening news shows? We see evening news shows, at least of a very large section, if not all the media, is basically targeting how each of these people deserve what the state has been doing through, semi-fake news, half-truths, propaganda. And that's how the narrative is continuously being built. And I think that obviously feeds into the people's sort of sense of what is happening. And I think that's the biggest factor which is actually responsible for a whole range of things. And the capture of the media by the ruling party and for the purpose of its own propaganda and agenda, I think that is one of the biggest challenges to independence of any section in other institutions, and even how the judiciary responds. I think that really makes a difference. And I think if we have to start addressing, what to rectify for us to have a genuine constitutional liberal democracy, I think that is one of the first things we should look at as to how we can go about addressing that.
As a media professional, again, I think I am not just surprised or shocked or appalled, but I think this is shameful. And I just wish to emphasize that point, because I think it's become a kind of central fulcrum which has impacted our society at large and will have very, very serious long-term effects. But anyway, moving on, how do then we counter these situations, including some of the harsh realities and constraints that face us in terms of conveying? How do we convince the police? How do we go to the courts? Not just lawyers, but even others. And how do we bring it home to the government? And I mean all governments really, all across the country, that this can't go on.
Yeah, so I think possibly, there's of course no obvious solution. It's a real challenge. So, but I think some of the ways I can think of are, have a spirited fight in the courts on what the issues are. You push the envelope as much as you can as a lawyer, as a constitutional lawyer, as a lawyer fighting for civil liberties, as groups fighting for civil liberties. So you take the legal route, you think strategically, you file cases strategically, and you function in terms of what will get the desired result for your clients. That's one aspect. And second aspect is, of course, a very, very effective, larger public advocacy, so as to be slowly changing the public mood, understanding. And I think on that, we'll have to think quite a bit out of the box, because the mechanisms of the past, which used to work in our Indian context, are not working because of, it's completely different socio-political communication strategies have to change, approaches have to change. And I think we'll have to really start thinking on those issues completely out of the box and think afresh. But I think there is a lot of scope to do that on issues of public advocacy, which should be combined with, legal fights in courts.
And do you see that it is possible?
No, I certainly am hopeful. I think times are obviously challenging today, but as challenging as times are, you have so many people who are youngsters who are graduating from college today. I see them, I hear them. They're very passionate about issues of their own liberty, and also, youngsters generally. I mean, teenagers and then, young college students are always the sort of main fulcrum for change in any society, because they have the most energy. They have the most positivity in terms of they have their whole lives ahead of them. So they are not hindered by their past experiences. So they offer me a lot of hope in terms of the potential for change in the medium term to the long term.
So thank you, Shahzan. On that note, hopeful note, your overall prognosis was anything but hopeful. I thought it was a little realistic, but also on the pessimistic side. On that note, we'll thank you for joining us here and explaining in lucid terms what human rights are and how they concern each and every citizen of India. That was Shahzan Farasat, constitutional lawyer in the Supreme Court, who has fought many cases of individuals whose civil rights have been violated, explaining to us what human rights are and what they should mean in the wider context of society, because they can affect you, me, and everybody, not just small sections. We will be back next week once again with another guest on the Wire Talks. That's it from me and the team. Goodbye. You can check out this podcast and other interesting ones on the Wire website, the IVM podcast website, app, or wherever else that you get your podcasts. Goodbye from me, Siddharth Bhatia, and the Wire Talks podcast team.
I hope you enjoyed that show. If you aren't following us on social media, please do. We're IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. Would like to thank the sponsors on the network this week, Cred, Ciet, and Global Victoria. Thank you so much for making this possible. On Cyrus Says, Cyrus is joined by the hilarious and extremely charming illusionist and therapist Suhani Shah. They talk about different aspects of magic like sleight of hand, mind reading, mentalism, and more. The Habit Coach completed 500 episodes, 500, and Ashton has a special message for us on the occasion. Do check that out. We had Lekini Desai, founder of the India Ethnic Company, talk to Varun Digirala about their story and the Hatke marketing idea that made them popular. On Naan Curry, South Africa just celebrated World Chocolate Day. They took us through the origins, history, economics of chocolate, and shared their memories. On Tere Mere Raste, Keshav Chaturvedi shares an interesting story from Leh. Check out an updated version of the Traveling Professor's Diary. It's now rechristened as Smarter with Sid. Same old brain filled with new stories and insights. This time, listening to know why you should keep things simple. And finally, check out Global Victoria Tech Talks. This one is in partnership with Global Victoria, the trade arm of the Government of Victoria and Australia. The edtech and gaming industries are booming in Victoria, Australia, and this series is meant to showcase that. And with that, I hope to see you again next week.
Whether you're an established sports person or a budding one, or simply a sports enthusiast, join us, Tanvi and Shlok.
We are two passionate pro badminton players talking policy, mindset, and everything sport.
So tune in to The Millennial Athlete every Monday.
Only on the IVM Podcast Network.
Trust us, it's gonna be lit.